The absolute loyalty of those wielding military power in remote borderlands has never been bought through hollow oaths or lifeless medals. Ancient monarchs understood a cold truth. When a man holds tens of thousands of troops at a frontier thousands of miles away from the court, the reach of the law becomes faint. To ensure that the sword would never turn its point backward, the sovereign power did not use iron chains, but rather a far more supple silk, royal favor bestowed upon the general's family. Keeping the families of these brave commanders within the capital, under the protective shade of the superior, was in fact a masterstroke of psychological manipulation, transforming flesh and blood ties into a life and death binding contract. Let us dissect this ruthless yet brilliant art of governance practiced by ancient courts. On the surface, everything unfolded like a play steeped in the affection between a ruler and his subject. When a general was entrusted with the heavy responsibility of guarding the borders, the court would welcome his parents, wife, and children to live in the most magnificent mansions in the capital. They were granted overflowing stipends, invited to lavish banquets, and received solicitous visits from the royal family. To the common people, this was a testament to the boundless generosity of an enlightened monarch, a worthy reward for one enduring the hardships of the winds and sands afar. Yet behind that velvet curtain was a political chessboard, calculated down to the last breath. Those extravagant mansions were in reality gilded cages, and the general's most beloved kin were noble hostages. The monarch did not need to point a sword at the family's throat to threaten them. The most silent and terrifying threat is the one wrapped in silk. The sovereign only needed to show the general that his family was nestled firmly in the palm of the court's hand. A mere wave of the hand from the superior could grant them ultimate glory, but a single scowl was enough to plunge the entire clan into the abyss of eternal ruin. In the desolate borderlands, surrounded only by wind, sand, and enemies, what would the general cling to in order to maintain his will? It was the image of his family living in peaceful luxury back in the capital. That very peace became his fatal weakness. The court skillfully planted an irreversible logical equation in the general's mind. His own survival on the front lines was directly proportional to the prosperity of his clan in the rear. He realized that the stipends his wife and children enjoyed were not a free gift, but an advance payment for his own life and absolute devotion. This art of manipulation reached its zenith at the most decisive moment, the moment of defeat. Imagine a grim scenario on the battlefield. The general is surrounded by wave upon wave of enemies. Reinforcements are non-existent, provisions are exhausted, and failure is a foregone conclusion. The primal human instinct for survival would scream, urging him to drop his weapons and surrender, or to find a blood-soaked path to escape and save his own life. If he were a free mercenary, he would flee without hesitation. But he is not a free man. He is a man carrying the weight of an entire clan residing at the feet of the Son of Heaven. Why, in that moment of despair, would the general choose to stay and fight to his last breath, charging into the enemy's ranks to meet a tragic end instead of seeking a way out? It was not an explosion of blind courage, nor was it entirely due to the patriotic dogmas the court had indoctrinated him with. It was the result of the most pragmatic and ruthless calculation a man must make in a split second. If he were to drop his sword and surrender to the enemy or flee like a coward, his life might be spared. But news of that betrayal and cowardice would fly back to the capital faster than the wings of a bird. What would the consequence be? The court's harshest sentence would fall upon the heads of the innocent people living in that gilded cage. Property would be confiscated, the family honor would be smeared, and most cruelly, his entire kin would suffer the most catastrophic punishments reserved for traitors. He would live, but his bloodline would be severed, and his family crushed under the wheels of the sovereign's power. Conversely, if he chose to fight to the death, throwing himself into the fray to earn the title of a loyal martyr, his death would become an invaluable bargaining chip. He used his very life to purchase safety, glory, and a future for his descendants. When the news of his heroic sacrifice reached the capital, the monarch would shed calculated tears before the civil and military officials. The court would hold a solemn funeral, bestow noble titles upon his eldest son, and ensure his family continued to enjoy special privileges. The general understood this ruthless rule of the game. He accepted the settlement of this blood contract with the court, for it was the only path to protect the most precious assets of his life. The question arises, did the general act out of gratitude for the court's care, or out of fear of his clan's destruction? The exceptional statecraft of the ancients never relied on only one half of the issue. It was a perfect and contradictory blend of both elements, grace and terror. If relying solely on fear, governance would create hidden traitors waiting for a chance to stab one in the back. If relying solely on gratitude, governance would become weak, for the human heart is fickle and easily forgets kindness when faced with death. A great monarch is one who knows how to transform fear into gratitude. The general at the border truly felt grateful to the court. He was grateful not for the delicacies and luxuries bestowed upon his family, but because his superior had given him an opportunity. A clear path for his clan to rise and survive in a cruel world. In an era where human life was as fragile as a leaf, the supreme power provided him with a solid insurance policy. Absolute loyalty leads to a glorious clan, while betrayal leads to total extermination. The clarity of that covenant put the general's mind at ease. He voluntarily stepped into the noose because he believed his sacrifice would be repaid in the most equitable manner. Furthermore, this system of velvet-wrapped hostages created a highly sophisticated mechanism of cross-control from within the general's own family. The wives and mothers living in luxury in the capital understood the source of their wealth very well. They knew that every bit of radiance they wore was exchanged for the loyalty of the man on the front lines. Thus, they inadvertently became the court's most diligent prison guards. Through letters sent to the frontier, they constantly reminded the general of the gracious rain and dew from above, of the family honor, and of the responsibility to fight to the death to protect the peace of his kin. The court did not need to send spies to watch the general, because his own loved ones did that work for them through the sacred bonds of affection. This was the pinnacle of the manipulation of power, turning victims into fervent accomplices who protected the very system that imprisoned them. The general did not feel forced to die. He believed he was choosing death for his family, for his honor. The monarch had successfully grafted the goals of the dynasty, protecting the borders, deep into the personal goals of the general, protecting his family. When these two goals merged, the sovereign power gained an ultimate defensive weapon, a combat machine that would never retreat, because behind him there was no path back, only a precipice for those he loved. Look deeper into the nature of loyalty in ancient dynasties. It was never a pure sentiment born of virtue. Loyalty was, in fact, an exquisitely designed structure of interests intended to neutralize any option of resistance from subordinates. The monarch did not need to know if the general truly loved him. The monarch only needed to create a situation where betraying the crown would bring consequences 10,000 times worse than sacrificing oneself for it. This tactic also thoroughly solved the problem of decentralization that always plagued kings and emperors. To expand borders and protect territory, they were forced to grant the power of life and death and the command of armies to generals. But power always tends to create arrogance and the desire for secession. How could one ensure a man holding tens of thousands of troops would not declare himself a warlord in a distant land? The answer was to seize him by the throat in the capital. The gilded cage containing his family was the remote control center of the dynasty. That invisible binding cord stretched from the throne to the most distant outposts, ensuring that all the glory the general won flowed back into the sovereign's treasury of power. We can see the extreme cruelty hidden behind the mask of beautiful words like loyal subjects and righteous warriors. The statues erected, the ancestral tablets worshipped, the praises sung of the integrity of generals who died on the battlefield. All were propaganda tools of the court to consolidate and rationalize a system that exploited life itself. The court glorified their deaths to encourage the next generation of generals to submissively hand over their families as hostages and continue following in the footsteps of that forced sacrifice. Posthumous honors were, in truth, part of a transaction in blood, a final payment from the monarch to close a perfect contract of manipulation. By seeing through these machinations, we realize that the history of power is not a chronicle of shining moral examples. It is a cold dissection of how those holding privilege manipulate psychology, exploit weaknesses, and harvest the most sacred of human emotions to serve their own longevity. Those majestic generals, who could command the winds and clouds on the battlefield, were ultimately just grand chess pieces, carrying deep-seated fears and heart-wrenching calculations for their own bloodlines. If a system of rule must use flesh and blood ties as hostages, use luxury to disguise chains, and use tragic death to cover the deprivation of freedom, then is that supreme power built on the greatness of the monarch, or merely on the sophisticated exploitation of the most painful weaknesses of the human condition? The wisdom of ancient rulers lay in creating brilliant illusions that made people voluntarily offer their entire lives. But when the velvet curtain falls, what remains behind an absolute loyalty? Is it perhaps just a submission that was too perfectly disguised?